So let's start, right? Hello, everybody, and good morning from Brazil. I am Clara Alves from Brazilian Interdisciplinary AIDS Association, and I'm glad to have you all here in the side event of the ordinary session of the UN Human Rights Council. I would like to thank you, the panelists, for accepting our invitation, the translators, and colleagues who help us with the organization. So, Big Pharma versus the people in the time of COVID, ways to safeguard the right to health is an initiative of the global campaign to reclaim people's sovereignty, dismantle corporate power, and stop impunity. Co-organized by ABIA, HEBRIP, Transnational Institutes, and ILPF. The global campaign is a network of over 250 social movements, civil society organizations, trade unions, and communities affected by the activities of transnational corporations. The global campaign has closely followed the sessions and process of the Human Rights Council, mainly through the incidents in the open-ended Intergovernmental Working Group on Business and Human Rights, demanding a strong binding convention on transnational corporations to guarantee human rights are respected in the corporate activities. However, the inequity in access to health in the COVID pandemic and farmers' behavior in profiteering made possible by the corporate capture again emphasizes the urgent needed to address the right to health and transnational corporations in the Human Rights Council. And more than denounce the pandemic situation, we would like to move forward and call actions to maximize the world response to a pandemic. With this, we expect that the participants will gain new strength in our claiming of right to health. So, before we start, I just want to let you know we will collect questions and comments in the YouTube chat. So feel free to interact with the panelists via YouTube. So first of all, we will hear from Rakim Ertani. She is Executive Director of Indonesia for Global Justice and member of the International Organizing Committee for Asian Europe People Forum. So please, Rakim, you can start.
Thanks, Clara, for the opportunity to join in this important event. I will try to make very short interventions, and because I believe that most of the participants are familiar with some informations that I will share in my presentations, but also it is also important to be reformed in this forum in order to ensure that we record the corporate monopoly and impunity behavior, especially the big pharmaceuticals companies during this pandemic. So you can see my screen now. Wait. Try. Oops, sorry. Okay, I'm sorry. Oops, yeah. So I think today we are still witnessing inequality in access to vaccines and medicines needed to combat COVID-19 in the world. So from this picture, we can see regions that are still far behind from the vaccination programs. Based on the global database of COVID-19 vaccinations, published by a journal, Nature Journal on June 2021, they have mentioned that there are large differences in vaccination rates between countries, and the data reveal large differences in the scale of the vaccine rollout across countries. As of 7 April 2021, the cumulative number the cumulative number of doses administered per 100 people ranged from 118 per 100 in the case of Israel to less than 0.1 doses per 100 in countries that have just begun their vaccination campaigns such as Mali and Namibia. So it can be seen that Africa is the most lagging region in vaccinating until it reaches the herd immunity. Furthermore, with the worsening of inequality, a lot of poor countries can only have full vaccinations only by 2023. I believe you already seen these figures. So Indonesia is no exceptions, although it has secured a total of 94 million doses of vaccine. This figure is only 20% of its total needs. So Indonesia itself needs around 426 million doses of vaccine to cover around 181 million people. So we still need about 300 million more doses of vaccines for two shots. So all these facts keep us away from the reality of the end of the pandemic because we heard all the times that no one is safe until everyone is safe. So yeah, of course, the cause of inequality in access to vaccines and medicine is due to limited productions and supply of vaccines worldwide. And this cannot be separated from the root of the problem, namely the control and monopoly of big pharmaceutical companies over intellectual property rights. So yeah, since the beginning of the pandemic, pharmaceutical companies have continued to adopt a business as usual approach, either by maintaining tight controls over their intellectual property rights or by pursuing secret commercial deals and monopolies and excluding countries that are badly affected by COVID-19. So defending the protection of the IPR monopoly also goes against the COVID-19 medicines and vaccines to be treated as global public goods. As you can see that in handling COVID-19, almost everything is related to IPR. Almost all health products such as test kits, diagnostics, masks, medicines, vaccines, and ventilators are protected under patents, trade secrets, and industrial designs. So this in turn opens up opportunities for the pharmaceutical industry to take advantage of a pandemic situations to extract profit as much as possible from the abuse of IPR protections and encourage monopolistic practices of knowledge productions, price, and supplies. So on the next slides are stories that have to be told and repeated about how big pharmaceutical companies are profiting from the pandemic situation. So I took this from an article, one of the article that I also read. So first, about the profiteering behavior. Uh, it it's on the profiting. An article mentions, yeah, on how much big pharmaceutical companies get profit from the IP monopoly supported by the governments in the North countries, while we know that they were funded by public money. In fact, the big pharma companies were showed in the beginning, yeah, were showed little interest in the race for vaccines. This is due to past experience. Making vaccines, especially in acute health emergencies, has not been shown to be beneficial. Only when governments and international agencies step in with funding agreements, that is when they can work on it. So governments and multilateral organizations have agreed to buy billions of doses at fixed price. So pharmaceutical companies selling to wealthy countries will certainly be able to start seeing returns on their investment. So if you can see from the numbers, like Pfizer and BioNTech, they claim that they cannot make enough money to justify the vaccine R&D investments are ridiculous. So we can see from these comparisons, they earn 100 times more than the R&D cost itself. And how they control it. So I think that is why they need to keep the control and monopoly on IPRs so they can get more profit even from the poor countries. So the race to secure vaccines, this is only the pictures in the presentations is only illustrations, and I think you have seen it before, yeah. So the race to secure vaccines has encouraged more bilateral deals practices. So they control it through the bilateral deals. The bilateral agreements between companies and the states have been done under the trade secret protections. It causes the enclosure of all informations required by the public, such as prices given and the quantity of supplies, including delivery schedules. For example, on price differences that has impacted from bilateral deals, the impact of a bilateral agreement between richer governments and producer of vaccines 19 vaccine has raised concerns of rising prices and lack of supply for low and middle income countries. This is where the big pharmaceutical companies have a chance to take advantage of the price game. So we have heard before on the issue of South Africa, where last January 2021, the Guardian reported on the issue of inequality regarding vaccine prices experienced by South Africa. In its article, it was stated that South Africa has to pay 2.5 times more than the European Union. So I think that is really a fact that really bad for the poor countries. And also the control of pharmaceutical companies over vaccine production cannot be separated from licensing practices that are often implemented in the midst of the pandemic. So according to MSF, companies holding IPR protections can apply licensing terms to other licensed producers, such as limiting supply to a limited geographic range and other conditions that limit the benefits of global competitions and supply. So this licensing practice is definitely carried out with an agreement that is highly confidential in nature. So this is why vaccine productions cannot be carried out on a massive scale and only limited to certain manufacturers that require special permissions from the IP owners. And even more, the bilateral deal has potentially become a tool for big pharmaceutical companies to threaten the poor and developing countries. They are afraid that in the future, there will be legal cases from the states for the adverse effects of the vaccines. Pfizer asks controversial demand where governments put up sovereign assets guaranteeing an indemnity against the cost of any future legal cases. So these two articles gave examples from Latin America and South Africa where Pfizer tried to put irresponsible requests in the midst of a pandemic crisis. So I think from here, uh, to end the corporate monopoly and impunity, we need to push more demands on, for sure, first, no IP monopoly on COVID-19 health products. So the TRIPS waiver is being negotiated at the WTO, and this is a pretty tough battle, yeah, because we can see a strong different positions between the rich countries and the sponsoring countries that still haven't been resolved. In fact, the next challenge after the TRIPS waiver, we still has the potential to hinder efforts to open access to, on COVID-19 vaccines and medicines due to control over technology and know-how. We don't know how far that these big pharmaceuticals will share their technology and know-how to other countries, so we can have massive productions and more wide distributions on vaccines, including on medicines and all health products that we need during this pandemic. So therefore, we still need alternatives actually. We need to support more developing countries that are currently developing vaccine candidates, which can then be directed to South-South cooperations. I think this idea can be a strong demand, yeah, that we can push to our South countries, yeah, how to find more vaccine alternative. And lastly, the very important aspect to end corporate impunity is for sure, how can we ask big pharmaceutical companies accountability that has prevented the states, especially in developing and underdeveloped countries, to implement their obligations, fulfilling the right to health in their countries? I think that's from my side. Thank you very much. I think it's very short intervention. Yeah.
Yeah, that was great, Rakim. Thank you very much. I believe that become very clear the scenario that we are facing. So to go on, I would like to introduce Harris Blackmon. He's Senior Fellow of the Center for Governance and Sustainability in the University of Massachusetts, Boston, from the United States. So please, Harris, you can go on.
Clara, thank you, and thank the organizers for putting together this workshop. As Rahmi has been explaining, I'd like to pick up on some of the themes that she was addressing. We are living in a period where there's an overwhelming destruction and unnecessary destruction of communities and families. It does not need to be so severe. Part of the severity is the nature of a new virus. Part of the severity is the failure of states, whether it's an inadequate medical infrastructure for normal healthcare or vaccine nationalism. And part of it is the commercialization of healthcare rather than a healthcare system built on human rights. And a good part of the severity of the commercialization of healthcare comes from the dominance of multinationals, big pharma and related companies, who are more concerned with the global market than human rights. But what is good is that a good part of the solution, the mitigation of severity of what we're seeing now and we're likely to see in future pandemics, will be when governments address and put in place the binding convention on human rights and transnational corporations. And this is because this convention, with the support, active support of civil society, is closing a loophole on liability, intentionally setting the primacy on healthcare on human rights over trade and monetary policies, and is seeking to set standards of human rights as the criteria that can be used in court cases involving transnational corporations. Let me elaborate on the consequences of having a commercialized base for healthcare and for responding to pandemics, rather than a human rights-based approach. Those who were in the industry and around the industry seeing the start of the COVID pandemic knew and were well aware of the major market so-called failures, the major market normal operating practices. And they created a system called COVAX to fix the market or the perception of the market as a COVID response. My work in this area is that I've been looking at the multi-stakeholder governance system that is evolving as a challenge to multilateralism, as a challenge to the Human Rights Council. And this multilateral, multi-stakeholder approach is intrinsic to COVAX. COVAX is actually an organization which is founded by two other multi-stakeholder bodies, plus the World Health Organization as a junior partner. And one of the conditions that COVAX introduces as a multi-stakeholder body is that responsibility, liability, obligations, key elements of normal international relations, become completely dissipated and diverse. Each participant in the group looks to the other and says, they're responsible, not us. A treaty on binding that addresses transnational corporations and human rights would clarify where responsibilities, obligations, and liabilities, key elements in international relations for hundreds of years, would lie in each of these areas. The money, and there are probably 3 or 4 other key elements that can highlight how the difference between a human rights approach and a commercial market approach on a global level is causing additional levels of misery around the world. One of these is that COVAX says to the world, we are providing universal access for 92 developing countries to the vaccine. Well, there are a couple of pieces of that which is not correct. These are not donations. These are not reaching out in a human rights-based way to provide vaccines. These are sales at a discount. And the cost by COVAX and by Big Pharma for the discounted price should be that the countries take more loans, go further into debt in order to address COVAX, to protect the concept of you have to buy healthcare. The second way in which this tension is clear is that COVAX is designed to fit into a competition, a geopolitical competition between the market, the supply of vaccines from China and from Russia. And nowhere is this clearer than in the internal system that COVAX has established to decide the priorities for which of these 92 countries get the vaccine and get the vaccine at what discount. They have established a 2-tier allocation procedure. Their notes, their rules are up on the web to look at. But internal to COVAX, there is a balancing act of their making the life and death decisions on behalf of the market about which countries, at what rate, and at what time. And as you saw from the earlier Rachmi slide about the prospective timetable going into 2023, when vaccines are going to be available in different parts of the world, the latter group is mostly those in Africa, you can see the power that COVAX has taken of making the decisions about where to go in response to market demands, in response to geopolitical claims and views, of turning the protection of the sale, the commercialization, rather than healthcare, into the next level of geopolitical battles occurring around the world. We don't need this. We don't need the misery that will come from the primacy given to the protection of the market. But it goes beyond this. If one is supporting the binding convention on human rights, it would make a big change that the debates about the WTO waiver on intellectual property, that healthcare debate should not be occurring in the World Trade Organization. Were the binding convention on human rights as advocated by civil society organizations, it would set human rights standards over trade standards, monetary practices, and macroeconomic loans from the IMF and the World Bank. One of the things that would happen to that switch is that instead of the health debates occurring in exclusively economic spaces, the UN Commission on Human Rights, the people who are meeting now, would become the place where discussions take place between countries and health ministries and the health secretariat of the World Health Organization about prioritizing health. That element would be an important rationale on its own for why all the countries participating in the UN Commission on Human Rights session now should become much more actively involved in developing the binding commission on TNCs and human rights. But there's another aspect to the waiver issue. Public discussion is about how to get a waiver from the World Trade Organization's intellectual property rules, which require unanimous consent of all the members of the WTO agreement. But the pharmaceutical industry and COVAX is circumventing that or taking a different view about waivers. They are asking recipient countries, those that they're trying to sell the vaccine to or supply it at a discount through COVAX, to agree to exempt them, to give them a waiver from any liability that may occur from the sale and use of their products. At the heart of the binding convention on TNCs and human rights is to address liability issues across borders. And I do have to admit, those of us working on that issue did not envision how a contract could exempt any form of liability from international scrutiny. So we have to go back and we need your help in introducing concepts like this into the binding convention on TNCs and human rights. The tension about how to reduce the misery and the severity of COVID can be in the hands of governments who are participating in the UN Commission on Human Rights by taking part and thinking through how to strengthen the provisions of the draft agreement that deal with the primacy of human rights over the economic rules in the world market today, over the human rights over the primacy of the commercialization of health, and to address the issue of avoidance of liability in all transactions, but including those affecting the availability of healthcare products. So, Clara, thank you very much again for inviting me to join, and I look forward to the conversation with everyone else. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Harry. So let's continue. I would like to invite Indranil Mukhopadhyay. He is Associate Professor at Hindu Global University in India and a People Health Movement member. So please, you can go on.
Thanks, Clara, and thanks, organizers, for doing this excellent discussion here. I would like to continue the discussion that has happened, the points Harish and Rachmi has brought in, the issues of binding treaty, the significance of the binding treaty, and also what Rachmi earlier said, the bilateral agreements, what kind of role they are perpetuating, they are playing in terms of perpetuating IP regime. Some of these have been already said, and I am not going to repeat this, apart from this fact that currently many developed countries, huge UK has more than 5 times the requirement of vaccines, whereas countries in the south have only less than half of their requirements. But then at the same time, one of the important members of the South, India, is one of the biggest manufacturers of vaccines in the world. Despite that, why is it the case that only half of its domestic requirement of vaccines could be fulfilled by India, and it failed to provide adequate support to the developing countries? What are the reasons behind this? because in the initial days of vaccine development, and India was very emphatic due to its because of its achievements. What happened in the subsequent? I'm not going to repeat this, but again depicting high levels of inequality and vaccines going to the richer countries. Okay, let me bring you back to the developments few months back during the initial phases of vaccine development. The people who, the scientists, the civil society were very euphoric about the scientific developments that took place, the kind of collaboration between public investment, global cooperation across scientific communities, and open access to certain crucial information on vaccines led to important discoveries. And people were thinking that now probably with such cooperation, the IP regime would be weakened significantly, and we'll see a new regime of cooperation. But world's strongest man in public health played a critical role in outsmarting some of these very well-meaning right-oriented people across the world. I'm referring to the Bill Gates and the role Gates Foundation played. If we recall, when director of Oxford Jenner Institute wanted to place the rights of COVAX-supported vaccine candidate in public domain, rightfully so, because it was highly supported and much needed, Gates, particularly Bill Gates, intervened. As a result, Oxford had to sign an exclusive vaccine deal with AstraZeneca. And we see what implication that particular deal has in the context of India, where one of the biggest manufacturers of vaccine in the world, the Serum Institute, which produces Covishield, is not able to scale up its vaccine production. I'm going to talk about a particular clause in this, the voluntary license, and its problems that has led to limitation in strengthening production capacity, and why, despite global calls supported by India and South Africa for TRIPS waiver, within their country, India is not able to provide compulsory licensing to scale up manufacturing of Covishield. Now, of course, Gates played a crucial role in preventing or perpetuating business as usual intellectual property. It started an ACT Accelerator program in March 2020 that gave pharmaceutical giants sole rights and no guarantee to low price. If we compare the ACT Accelerator program and the CTAB that WHO had earlier proposed, we'll see that there are so many issues and challenges. And because of Gates' promptness, the ACT Accelerator got more prominence in the global order. Though the big pharma lost interest over time on ACT Accelerator, but there are critical things that ACT Accelerator failed to deliver on. And if we look at the reasons why it failed, we have to see that how it actually, this public-private partnership actually encouraged IP protections. It didn't prohibit side deals between countries, the bilateral agreements. As a result, COVAX platform has only been able to produce 50%. And then, of course, it didn't challenge the IP regime and allowed IP protections happen. In comparison, the CTAB was a much progressive initiative. It was an effort to somewhere pool rights to technologies at various levels. So the holders in CTAB could have the rights to knowledge, data, technologies, but they were also in a situation where they could pool this together, learn from each other, and foster greater cooperation. We see how Gates played crucial role in undermining CTAP and fostering accelerator. This despite the fact that large part of the global support of accelerator came from public funded or multilateral donor funding with very little support from the private donors. And this is the strength of the current regime, that despite governments putting forward their effort, the IP protections remain a central tenet of the deals. And when we go back to the kind of bilateral agreements that has happened in this period, we have to see that voluntary licensing plays a very crucial role, and it has several weaknesses and issues that impinge access to medicine and technology. First and foremost is the lack of transparency that we see in the voluntary licensing. There are several ways this works. And then sometimes it prevents the transparency clauses, prevents public and governments from scrutinizing the terms and conditions. So we yet in India, despite repeated attempts, do not know what were the particular terms between AstraZeneca and Bharat Biotech on the Covishield. And then the existing legal mechanisms within the country, this is the case in India, but many other developing countries, that the legal mechanisms remain inefficient and weak, insufficient and weak to allow for better transparency. And that's one of the critical elements that we need to, among other things, need more regulation of voluntary licensing. And then there are varying terms through multiple licenses. So patent holding companies prefer first bilateral licenses with generic manufacturers, and then they go into multilateral agreements. And that's why they limit the ability to replicate production, scale up production. And then these voluntary licenses have very broad scope of patent. It includes pending applications also. It includes appeals to be rejected patent applications. And in any future patent applications are also prevented. So such broad scope of patent actually becomes another key barrier in access and scaling of production at the with the generic companies. And then there are geographic limitations, which I'm going to come through a case study that I'm going to talk about, the Remdesivir case study and the case of India. Okay, and then there are so many other restrictions. And the voluntary license, the other crucial point with VL is that it restricts research and clinical studies in a major way. So you do not have any way to use voluntary licensing to scale up production beyond the level that has been put in place. So we need to challenge the regime of voluntary licensing, very critical, very crucial. So let's look at the Remdesivir case. The Gilead Sciences, the original company, had voluntary licensing to some developing countries, including India. So few Indian companies were given, despite limited efficacy of the drug. It was rapidly used across the country and in many developing countries. But the way the VL was issued, there were several problems with it. So even though the production cost was relatively less in India, the Indian companies could not reduce the price and it had to sell at a price that was fixed by Gilead. And then, of course, there were restrictions to sell it to the other countries. In fact, all high-income countries, Brazil, South American countries, China, Russia, almost half of world's population were excluded by the use of voluntary licensing. I'm not saying remdesivir is crucial, but voluntary licensing, the role it plays in impeding access, we need to recognize and take it head on. But then what are the possibilities, alternatives? I think there are several alternatives that are emerging across the developing world. And within the current patent regime, we can use, many countries can use compulsory licensing to augment domestic production of vaccines and other COVID technologies. That is needed, and to scale up manufacturing and better access in developing countries. In fact, when we come back to India, it plays a very dubious role. While it is advocating for waiver at the global level and helping build South-South collaboration through its TRIPS waiver proposal within the country, to the Supreme Court of India, the Indian government has made a petition that it cannot allow compulsory licensing to be used for the Covishield because of the voluntary license agreements that it has signed up, and no one knows what are the clauses of this agreement. So then now of course there are so much of discussion happening on the TRIPS waiver, and though there are limitations within the proposal, one of the things that the proposal has done is to bring that global coalition together of the countries in the South and some developing countries, which might have far long-term implications on challenging the patent regime, if not within the current waiver scheme, but it can foster new kind of cooperation. We also see cooperation happening around some of the developing countries, like the Progressive International, where countries are coming together, making pleas to share their technologies and issues and very open access to technologies. Several of the developed countries also have changed their patent regime and going for compulsory licensing. So there is a lot of scope for countries to bring coalition and bring forces together and use an open access system where intellectual properties are rejected thoroughly. And lastly, I would like to put forward the case that the Cuban vaccines that are coming up, very encouraging results. And what the Cuba government has said, that the 5 vaccines that are at various stages of development, and also now some are at the mass production level, it would be free from all IP protections. And they're open to hand over the technology and rights to manufacture for developing countries and all the technologies they're going to share. I think this can be a case where developing countries can learn from experiences like Cuba and foster greater cooperation among the southern countries and bring in and take the IP regime head on and break its base monopoly challenges. I've used these sources for my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you a lot, Niranu. It was very, you bring many inspirations to us. It was very good to hear you. Before I pass to the next panelist, I would like to encourage interaction in the YouTube chat. Just to let you know, we will collect questions and comments and bring to the panelists after all the initial presentations. So, continuing, I would like to invite Manuela Holland. She's professor in the Juiz de Fora Federal University in Brazil and coordinator of the HoMA, the Human Rights and Business Center. So please, Manuela, you can go.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I'd like to greet all my colleagues and to thank Zabia and the Global Campaign for the invitation and to put this event together. I think this pandemic has shown that human rights needs or ways to accomplishment cannot be dependent on business, and especially transnational corporations' interests, as my colleagues have already said. So we have to control their activities and reorient it towards human rights directions and logic. So I will go back a little bit to the beginning of the treaty process on business and human rights to strengthen my arguments. As all you know, although the discussions on the thematic of business and human rights as an UN agenda initiated in 1970s with the expansion of globalization and the power of transnational corporations, it was only in 2011, about 40 years later, that the guiding principles on business and human rights represented in the sphere of the UN Human Rights Council, and it began to be recognized as a kind of official paradigm on business and human rights. However, and we have to highlight this point, that not forgetting it, and that's why we are negotiating a treaty now, due to voluntaristic characteristic and the many gaps presented in the principles that prevented him to offering effective solutions to face specifically the transnational corporations' impunity in relation to human rights violations. The guiding principles was not considered sufficient since its beginning. It is a fact. One of the main gaps identifier are, for example, a good definition of transnational corporations that should include mechanisms to raise the corporate veil, including also the nature of the transnational activity through its supply chain, and a good definition of supply chain. The guarantee of human rights primacy over investment in commercial agreements, trade agreements, as we have seen from those presentations here, what's very important to the global south. And as we saw, racism has influenced the access to health and the distribution of vaccines. Extraterritorial mechanisms, direct obligations to transnational corporations, efficient remedies, solutions to the corporate capture, and many other aspects. That's why we had the approval of the resolutions 26/9 in 2014, with a specific mandate oriented to start a treaty negotiation process in order to fill those gaps, regulating transnational corporations' activities, and also to improve some mechanisms that has been used in favor of companies instead of preventing human rights violations, such as the due diligence-oriented process, for example. But surprising, up until now, we have been forgetting Resolution 26/9 and have been giving a huge importance to the guiding principle, which in capacity to achieve our main objectives or goals have already been proven. So an important question must be raised. Do we just need to make guiding principles and due diligence mandatory? My answer is no. And I'm telling so not because I defend a kind of bold proposal and not possible to be accepted by international law. I defend the mandate of Resolution 26/9 in many positions presented by several states, including the presidency of the working group, experts, and civil society organizations during the last 6 sessions. First of all, we have to consider the primacy of human rights over investment and commercial agreements that was removed from the first document presented by Ecuador, the elements. The scope was modified in this respect of Resolution 26/9 was established on Draft 1. The Draft 2 keeps the reach of all business and covers all types of economic activities. Thus, due to the huge amount of business and their differences that vary according to the supply chain size, the segment of its activities, its international reach, among others. The writing of the articles that defines the scope contributes to the loss of effectiveness of the treaty that should be aimed to the TNC's actuation. No? Also, the draft composition did not list the Commission or Omission Acts. We are also extremely concerned with the insufficient mention of the supply chain discussion and the lack of liability provision on all entities involved in transnational business activity along the supply chain, including also the application of the Solidarity Obligation Institute. As a proposal for the treaty, for example, the Global Campaign suggests the following description. For the purpose of this treaty, the TNC supply chain consists of companies outside TNCs that contribute to the operations of the TNCs, from the provision of materials, services, and funds to the delivery of products for the end user. The supply chain also includes contractors, subcontractors, or suppliers with whom the parent company or the companies it controls carry on established business relations. The TNC may exercise influence over a supply chain company depending on the circumstances. We don't have the mention of direct obligations to TNCs, which is essential. On top of that, we are not suggesting a reinvention of international law, since there are already international treaties and instruments that include obligations and make legal procedures like TNCs legally responsible. Even some investment treaties. Some of the international treaties that it could mention are United Nations Conventions Against Corruption, United Nations Conventions on the Law of the Sea, the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutant, Basel Convention on the Control of Transboundary Movements of Hazardous Wastes and their disposal is another, and even the South Center report that about draft 1 has already mentioned the Inter-American Commission report on DESCAS that was launched last year and recognized those direct obligations. In addition, the draft 2 fails to address the important issue of lifting the corporate veil. The corporate veils prevents all entities in the supply chain from having a common legal existence, so each one is considered an independent legal entity. This fact presents itself as an obstacle to recognition of the parent company's legal liability for violation caused by other enterprises in its supply chain, despite the connection between them. It's essential that the parent company disclose all the information of the entities that are part of that chain. In this sense, the treaty must establish clear mechanisms to declare legal liability between the parent companies in all parts of the supply chain. Even though the draft 2 mentions the due diligence process, it is in its Article 6, it's not sufficient to consider it as an advance. It's necessary to promote an independent monitoring due diligence with focus on human rights. It's proven that it's not possible to trust the companies to monitor their own actions and decisions in relation to human rights. And for some activities, the nature of the institute must change from a means obligations to a result obligation. Meaningful consultation and substantial relations have to be shown, and it has to include a broad conception of links among the business and financial institutes, also guarantee transparency and effective participation of the civil society presumably affected. Cooperation is also crucial, is a crucial issue, not only to produce information needed, but if you consider the pharmaceutical sector, for example, you have to establish a more technical and intellectual and not just assistential cooperation based on the universal right to health and the primacy of human rights, as already mentioned. So one final observation, guiding principle implementations, due diligence laws, and also the treaty proposal are still extremely state-oriented texts that close the eyes to the transnational influence in state territories, its economical and political realities. I think that you have, unfortunately, to come back to Salvador Allende's speech in 1970s and reevaluate our paths. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Manuela. Thank you, Wow. I believe that that were very good interactions, and we learn a lot about the pandemic and also all the process in the Human Rights Council. So we will start with a first question, as we agreed, from Maulana. She was in the link of YouTube from Indonesian translation. So the question is, Pfizer has made a statement that does not want to be responsible for any follow-up events after vaccination. After all, it's their own vaccine. How do you sue a pharmaceutical company? Is there a post-vaccine failure? This is the first question. I can copy it and put in the chat for the panelists. I have two more questions for you. So the first one is, vaccine shortage and inequality of access, as we saw, have highlighted the limits of COVAX. So maybe this is for Harris. Do you believe that this reality somehow challenged the plans to transform the ACT into a permanent instrument to new pandemics? And the last one, in addition to patents, other intellectual property rights are covered by the proposed waiver from India and South Africa. I would like to hear a little more about the relevance of also suspending trade secrets protection rights in the context of the pandemic. Maybe I could add also that we could also hear from any other intellectual property rights that will be included in waiver besides of patents, maybe for Indra. So who would like to start?
Clara, I
Yes.
can try to respond to the first questions from Maulana, but I think Manuela, Harris, and Indranilda later can add some points. But what I can respond to the questions, actually, like I mentioned in my presentations, how these big pharmaceutical companies also try to secure themselves, from these legal cases, that will happen in the future, possible happen in the future, in relations to the impact of vaccinations program. Because until now, we never know what kind of reactions or impact from the vaccine itself. But at least from the informations and data that, and perhaps from the data of the clinical trials that mentions that no harmful impact that can be happen to humans, for examples. But unfortunately, when the governments or the COVAX has conversations with these companies, we never know what kind of informations that available or they have written in the agreements itself. For example, besides Indonesia, access COVAX facility, where we receive also AstraZeneca. We also have bilateral agreements with Pfizer because we also order from Pfizer, for example. But we don't know what kind of provisions that perhaps can allow the states, to ensure that there will be no impact, or harmful impact to the peoples, from the side effects of the vaccines. But I agree one more time, because we have a big issues on how we can ask corporate accountability in relations to their behavior, while on the other side they expect more profit from selling vaccines, but then we don't have any mechanisms, or we don't have like Harris mentioned, that even the international mechanisms now really weak, to ask the accountability of these big pharmaceutical companies. But I believe what Manuela has explained, we still have a possibility, with even with current system, or in the future we will have another instrument that we can bring the corporate to be accountable with their monopoly and impunity behaviors, practices. So I think that's my short interventions of the questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Rakim. Manuela just asked to talk. You can go on.
Yes, I think that these questions reinforce the importance of the treaty, and a treaty that has to, of course, face this problem systematically, because you have to guarantee the primacy of human rights over, of course, trade agreements and other financial agreements. And this has a guide of the companies, and especially transnational corporates' activities, of course, and they couldn't, of course, establish other agreements without really respecting this global treaty. And I think that establishing direct obligations to TNCs is also a key aspect, and it has to be linked to an international court, in my opinion, because they are asking about making accountable and how to sue, maybe a kind of remedy that could be more efficient. So instead of depending on just the national aspect that could be more influenced by the power of international cooperation, you could have an international court on business and human rights that could sue especially TNCs.
Thank you very much, Manuela. Maybe Harris, would you like to add anything else?
Yes, I would. Thank you. I'd like to jump in on response to two of the questions. At the heart of what prompted the intergovernmental system to start the negotiations on a binding convention on TNCs and human rights is the issue of liability exclusion, liability avoidance. The world's market at the moment has free movement of capital, relatively free movement of labor when it's needed, but the boundaries of national jurisdiction and the boundaries created by the legal liability structure of individual companies prevents that element from being globally open. And I think that one of the issues that's central for governments and others to thinking about how to participate in the binding treaty work is to think about the ways in which they and their citizens can look at a structure that allows cross-border jurisdiction about liability issues. That cross-border barrier needs to be overcome for both criminal charges by the state, administrative actions by the state, as well as civil actions by community organizations and individuals. To give one example of what could be included into the binding treaty to make those 4 different systems work, is that crucial documents about liability are often in other countries than where the injury occurred. And we need a system where one government can communicate with the relevant parts of another government, where courts can ask the assistance of other courts, where parties to a civil suit can ask the courts in another country to help to require that documents and evidence and witnesses are made available in the country of injury. This is not an unusual feature in domestic law in any of the democratic countries in the world. And there's no reason why the barrier of territorial barriers or legal barriers should prevent the effective access to documents and witnesses to determine, as Manuela has carefully explained, various systems of control in the production chain. So I think that what we ought to be encouraging and pushing our various governments to do to join this process actively in order to define how to address this question of liability avoidance. On the issue of the question about whether the transformation of the ACT, the accelerator program, into a permanent instrument, this is a battle ongoing. Those who conceived of COVAX and its related institutions, which includes ACT, have a vision in their mind about how the future market for vaccines and vaccine-related products and research are to be organized. A vision which may not be shared precisely by individual firms in the sector, but it's the effort to fix the way in which vaccines and other medicines that relate to that are available in the global market. And so there's a struggle going on within the elites of the world pharmaceutical industry as to what should be the characteristics going forward. And I think that one of the features that needs to be addressed, and this relates to also to the waiver question, is to move from just a view about the opportunity provided by a waiver of intellectual property rights through the WTO to a wider discussion about human rights-based access to healthcare and how this should envision how a global market should operate or lay the basis for that going forward. Thank you very much, Clara.
Thank you, Harris. And then I think Ivern, you can also contribute with Phil's comments.
Yeah, very briefly on the trade secret bit, I completely agree. And there are many ways that the trade secrets actually create barrier. Sometimes in the country laws, the national laws, trade secrets get defined very broadly. And that allows companies to claim any type of business information as confidential, including licensing terms and conditions. And that even governments, even civil society fail to, despite repeated attempts, fail to get the required classified information. So they're denied often. So we need to, we need to actually, so the Weber proposal talks about trade secrets along with patents in a major way. So that's a positive development, that this needs to, trade secrets needs to be very strictly defined and regulated properly. So I think we need to have more openness in these, and we should have all license agreements signed in and brought in public domain so that they can be scrutinized and any effect on people's lives can be averted, and the prices particularly and the kind of profit sharing agreement that there are mere levels of profit sharing that happens. And I think it is important that we bring these trade secrets into public domain and try to use them as a tool to demand greater accountability. It cannot, agreements as a tool to bring in greater accountability. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Indranil. So we have two more questions. The first one is from Graciela. She did it in Spanish. I just translated to English. She asked, is there any effort toward transparency on vaccine prices? And the last one is from Claudio Schufan. And he commented, and then he asked, over the last 4 years, public interest civil society organizations and the civil society organization campaign on the treat have seen more setbacks than gains, given the rigid position of the rich countries defending their transnational corporations. Given this scenario, and coming closer to a final text of the treaty that does not respond to our demand, what will we do? Very changing. So I will also share with you the questions in the chat, but someone would like to start? Go on, Manuela.
I don't know if I can really answer the second question. What should we do? But I think that there a different aspect. No, we just would you realize in this situation that a treat is needed. It's a fact. So we cannot say, okay, because sometimes to have a kind of track, we say, okay, it's difficult to negotiate because we're facing the European Union and the other parent representative of parent companies and so on. And so it's so difficult to negotiate. We're just failing to advance and so on. So what we're gonna use or maybe turn to other alternatives such as the dealer's law or national plans. I think that it's the opposite. You know, you have to reorganize to make it more clear to people and social movements the needed of this treaty, because this is the question, because they are just resisting from it because it's so needed and maybe it's necessary. It's going to change the paradigm. No, it's the only thing I see that could really change something in the international level that's really needed. So I think that we have to strengthen the networks that we have. Of course, talking about or dealing with human rights nowadays is difficult in any field, no, in a multilateral system. So you have to reinforce strength, better saying that is strength our networks and bringing it back to the social movements, the need of this treaty, and keep negotiating and using our strategy that we have been using to with the treaty, many states that have been supporting it. I think that there is no alternative.
Before I pass to Indranil, I would like to suggest that maybe we can respond all the questions and already do a final comment on the event. Then we will finalize. So if you want to do it, Manuela, or maybe later. Oh, let's pass to Indrani first.
Okay,
Okay.
very briefly, I have taken a lot of time, and this has been a fascinating discussion, very fruitful. But somewhere I feel that there is a need to broaden our alliance across across political parties, trade unions, social movements, the civil society, and also various campaigns. But I think there is nothing new that we need to do. But I think it is time that we do things with renewed vigor, with greater strength, and come together and resist the dominance of IP protection. There are certain possibilities emerging around the world. It is Progressive International being one, and People's Health Movement, and there's so many other coalitions that are coming up. So I think we need to strengthen each other and come with greater vigor and resist this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If no one wants to add anything else, I think I can give you Harris. Would you like to?
I want to pick up on one of Indrani's slides earlier and on one of the questions. And it's about the way in which voluntary solutions are the current paradigm in the social, economic, gender, human rights space. In the human rights area, we're facing voluntarism by the effort of to have the Ruggie principles be voluntarily accepted, to allow voluntary responses by firms and voluntary efforts by countries. However, when one goes over to the economic space, there are obligatory requirements. And it's this imbalance which has to be rectified in part of the change in the paradigm. Voluntarism in social areas, in economic areas, in issues of racism, in issues of gender equality, go up against well-structured opposition in the societies. Those who want to do something different can. Those who don't want to, because they're beneficiaries, because they find advantages in inertia and not acting, or because they find support more widely for right-wing authoritarian thinking, those folks have an escape valve. An escape valve that's magnified by those few firms, those few countries who take the voluntary principles, the soft law, and say, we're going to act on them. And we need to shift that paradigm much closer to what occurs in the trade regime, where we have to have a battle to move away from an obligatory rules on intellectual property, where we have to have a battle about the way in which the IMF and the World Bank provide money with conditionalities for healthcare in order for countries to address the degree of misery from the COVID crisis. We have to address that mentality and switch our paradigm in that area. I want to invite people who are listening to look at the website of the Friends of the Earth International and the Transnational Institute in Amsterdam, where they can see the broader critique of multi-stakeholderism's consequences in the COVAX structure, and that publication can be helpful to see how voluntarism, now not just centered around governments, but increasingly in a voluntaristic governance system centered around the firms who have an interest in a particular global public policy area. And I thank you again for inviting me to join this conversation.
Thank you, Harris. In Renew, would you like to respond the question that you?
So I have not seen the question properly, but what I gathered from what you shared earlier is that, and also to respond to the issue of prices, we have seen several discrepancies and in prices, and it depends on the ability of a country government to be able to negotiate prices with the big pharma a lot in the current regime, where you have to buy more than 4/5 of the total vaccine from market, because the COVAX at the max is going to give you only a fifth. In such condition, I think it is important that developing countries come together. Say, for instance, African Union is doing to some extent, coming together to bargain for better prices. But then that can happen when more opportunities come, when production increases, and we see more supply of vaccines. Currently, many of the big pharma has given its advanced market commitments to the developed world and have got very good bargain in their favor. So unless we have as developing countries, we have better bargaining tool, collective bargaining mechanisms, given the current regime, it would be difficult for smaller countries, less developed countries. So while we need to strengthen obligatory institutions where rights are ensured, we also need greater cooperation across countries. And some of the, what we are seeing is the better of countries getting away with better deal, even within the developing countries. So there are so many examples that I can cite. We need to resist that. And the purchasing power or GDP per capita cannot be a correct measure to determine prices in this current situation. So we need to look at multiple factors. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I will give you the floor to do your final comments. Then we can finish the event. Maybe we can start with Raquel.
Yes, thank you, Clara, and thank you for all speakers for your valuable contributions. So I think in my last comments, as a closing statements, also I would like to reaffirm that during this pandemic, in relations to the business as usual approach that has been done by the big pharmaceutical companies and supported by the North countries, I think what we need today actually a truly alternative. I think we have a lot of we have ability to create more alternative, especially when we are talking about alternative of vaccines. Like in Indonesia, we have one of candidates of vaccines. We call it vaksin merah putih. But yes, we are in very slow progress. But I believe, but if we have more support to advancing this research and clinical trials on the effort to find candidates, alternative candidates of vaccines, we believe that we can independently producing and then supply not only for our countries but also to join in the global solidarity to end the inequality of access of vaccines and medicines during this pandemic. And the second issues also that really important, how to stop the corporate monopoly and impunities. I think we know that the international instruments now or international organizations, the existing even in the UN itself becomes yeah, it's really weak. Yeah, even when Harris mentioned about the multi-stakeholderisms during this pandemic, we should bring back the role of the states, and then the strong responsibilities of the states to fulfill people's rights, especially to fulfill the rights to health itself. I think this is really important, and not to give the decision making process to the business sector or even to the multi-stakeholderisms forum that not put people first on the discussions. So I think that's the last comments from my side. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rockney. Please, Harris, you go next.
I want to pick up on two pieces that were raised earlier. One is one of the slides that Rockney shared with us about the forecasted access to vaccines under the current regime, showing that almost all of the African continent is projected to be have vaccine availability by the end of not next month, not this year, not next year, the year after 2023. Now, that, of course, is a projection into the future, but it shows how the future consequences, particularly for the African continent, and at the moment, particularly for South Africa, are really being set aside. And I think that's why many of us are saying that this has to change, to respond, needs a change in our whole paradigm of thinking. And I think that one of the ways in which we can do that is to invite others and to invite government officials who have a public position to say, as Indira was saying, alliances between various social movements and governments to take a qualitatively different approach because of the severity of the pandemic that we are now facing. There is no need for this degree of severity in the world at the moment. And I think that we all, and those who are listening to and joining this program, can see that there's a need for urgent action across a wide range of platforms and efforts. And we welcome continuing to work with everyone who's trying to do that. Thank you very much again.
Indra, you go next.
Yeah, I think thanks again. Much has been said. I'll just say that I'm reminded of the Alma-Ata Declaration, the kind of South-South cooperation Alma-Ata had proposed. Had we been following that kind of spirit, I think we would have seen a different world today. Despite saying that, I would say that the kind of appetite the big pharma had shown towards developing countries and lack of confidence of the developed world towards the developing countries in developing indigenous technology, some of it has been demystified and broken in the current context of the pandemic. Several developing countries are in the process of discovering vaccines, producing vaccines. I think the time is that we bring together all these forces and foster our energy and create work towards a new world order where we see health as a global public health and uncompromised human right. I think that's the last thing, more like a rhetoric and utopia, but that is the world we are struggling for. So thank you so much for giving me so much.
Thank you. Finally, Manuela.
Yes, I would like to thank you all again for giving me this space and to share this space with you. I think that we have, as has already been said, to work for a more democratic and international scenario that works for human rights and not against human rights. We have to contribute to the election of people who could also work for human rights instead of someone as like Bolsonaro in Brazil. So he is responsible. I couldn't avoid saying that he's responsible for more than 500,000 deaths in Brazil. And he has doing that working with some sectors of companies and transnational corporations and some, of course, business interests. So you have to think about it and avoid his re-election in next year. And I think there's all those this in democratic and human rights ambience that favor knowledge, that favor distribution, that favor cooperation, that favor multilateral systems is very important, and you have to regain this space. Thank you very much.
So thank you all. I believe that more than show for everybody the scenario that we are facing with inequality of access of vaccines and other technologies related to COVID in the world. We also proposed some alternative to respond the pandemic with the Biden treaty, which is in negotiation now in the Human Rights Council, and also the TRIPS waiver in the WTO. And just to catch this opportunity, I would like to also share with you that today it's a very important day in Brazil to the movement of access to medicines and also access to all the health technologies. We expect to vote in the National Congress of Brazil a bill that allow the compulsory licenses of the all technologies related to COVID. It is the 12 bill, the project of law 12 bill that respectively been voting today. We also are sharing a national campaign to press the deputies in the Congress to vote, allowing the suspension of the intellectual property rights in Brazil. I just shared in this chat in all languages the site of this campaign. I would like to invite you to visit this site. Unfortunately, the content is only in Portuguese, but you can find some boxes to fulfill, and then press the deputies by sending emails for them. I can also share more information by our social medias. Please feel invited to see all our materials and all the sites of our organization, which has been organizing these events. So thank you very much. Thank you to the panelists who accepted our invitation. Thank you also to all the colleagues from the Global Campaign who help us with this event, like Claudio and Leticia. You were very important to let us arrive here. Thank you for the interpretation. Thank you for the interpreters, the Brazilian and the Indonesian interpreters. It's to me very good to have Indonesian interpretation for us. And also, thank you for our technical team. So that's it. I hope everybody has enjoyed it. And let's continue with this struggle for right to health. Thank you very much. Let's finish.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Clara and Manuela, Harris, Indranil, and everybody.
You can keep here. I will ask Cristiano to end the live.